And welcome everybody to the panel session of this morning. We're going to be debating some of the key challenges around doing great content marketing to professionals. The goal of the panel is for you to really walk away at the end with some insights and hints and tips that can help you as you rethink what great B2B marketing looks like for your organisation or indeed your client's organisation. So, as Henry mentioned, we are joined today by some of the sharpest minds in the agency business and also representing a range of agency disciplines as well. So I'm really pleased to say that we have the sort of the B2B arms of the big networks. We have the independents represented and the sort of the tech specialists. And we also have the classic, what we call classic media agency represented as well. So I'm going to introduce the panel. So Laura Milsted is the EMEA MD of Interprise B2B, which is part of the Dentsu Aegis network, formerly known, the artist formerly known as Cara Enterprise. See what you did there. Also, I'd like to introduce Sinead Woodley. Sinead is the UK MD of April 6. April 6 is an independent agency focusing specifically on doing great things for tech brands.
Good morning.
And Nick, I would like to introduce Nick. Nick is the UK CEO for Maxus. And everybody will have heard of Maxus and the WPP and Group N that it's part of. Maxus is a global network of local agencies. And finally, Alex Brayshaw is a business partner at OgilvyOne Business, which is an agency that was formed from the marriage of the key Ogilvy B2B agency in 2014 and the creative agency DNX. So thank you all for joining. So a little confession to make. So we were here sort of 10 minutes. We didn't have any donuts, unfortunately. So if there's any spare, we'd appreciate it. But we got here 5-10 minutes before to get mic'd up and have a chat and get to know one another. And we thought it would be a good idea to define what content marketing to professionals actually is, because we feel that if we didn't do that, we could get sidetracked and potentially not get into the meat and give you that value, which is what we want to do. So I quote, and you heard it here first, content marketing to professionals is understanding your audience and giving them what they want or need. So we're not going to debate that anymore. We're just going to move on from there. So that feels like a good place to start, audience. B2C, and we've heard about this morning, it feels like B2C's got a bit of a head start when we think about focusing on the audience. So Nick, I'd like to come to you because you obviously run an agency that runs across and has clients across both B2C and B2B. What do you think B2B has to learn from our friends at B2C?
I think the kind of wild, crowd-pleasing answer is probably something along the lines of not a huge amount when it comes to actually producing content. I think B2B was actually in a lot of ways way ahead of the broader B2C market in leading the charge in content production, content creation. But I think its genesis tended to be in lead gen. And every time I kind of come across a B2B agency, and I think we do this ourselves, the kind of standard riff is B2B is actually B2H or B2P or whatever it might be. And I don't think that we do a great job as an industry about reflecting that claim to human insight in the content that we produce on the B2B side. Now, I think that's because of the genesis in lead gen, but I also think it's because of a far more complex consumer journey. So most B2B consumer journeys are more complex than B2C, involving more stakeholders, more departments, and therefore it can be harder to identify what content ought to be targeted at what end of that consumer journey. So the B2C one is much simpler, where at the top of the funnel you know what kind of content to produce, and at the bottom of the funnel you know what kind of content to produce. So I think if there was one disparity, it's that absolute nailing, that laser focus on portion of consumer journey, portion of funnel, and the kind of content that's being produced, where B2C are probably a little further ahead.
Got it. How far ahead do you think they are?
Well, it's a how long is a piece of string question. I think it depends on the advertiser. I think we see because B2B content was ahead of that game in terms of timing and chronology, I see an awful lot more B2B content out there.
Yeah.
And it's quite tempting as an advertiser just to repurpose or produce large reams of content and then just kind of spray and pray.
Yeah.
And I think that element is less so in B2C, where the content tends to cost more to produce often. And actually it is far easier to identify what element of that funnel you're targeting it at.
Okay.
Dependent on the advertiser.
So you mentioned there something around, and we've been talking today about moving from B2B to, I'm going to get this, B2B to B2P, but you mentioned B to H then. And I'm guessing you're talking about business to human.
Yes.
Good. So
I hope so. Anyway, there's a lot of B2s.
There's a lot of B2s, right? Yeah. So with that, and this is a question actually for Laura. How emotional do you think a brand can really get when talking to how emotional can a B2B brand really get when talking to a consumer? And we've seen some great examples about that connection being made earlier today. Mercedes, Shell, and EY doing particularly good jobs of that. But how easy is it to make that emotional connections when you're talking about cloud storage, professional services, and some of those other things?
I think the simple answer is very, because
Okay.
I think you actually can get very emotive in this space. People don't always make that natural connection. But I think if you break it down to the component parts and what you're talking about, and Alex was talking about the sort of where B2C sit, and then where we've evolved to in B2B, actually it becomes quite fundamental, because if you look at the complexity of the decision-making unit, the path to purchase, and ultimately the costs involved of the software system that's being purchased, the infrastructure. So the emotive element for me comes very firmly down to, actually, this is a business risk potentially that someone's looking into. So if you're the CMO, the CIO, the CEO, are actually within the decision-making unit itself, so an IT decision maker, a business decision maker within that complex, a diverse unit, you are potentially putting your business at risk based on the system that you're actually, signing up to, whether that's a data storage system costing millions of pounds. So the emotive part comes into the fact there's a business risk, but actually the personal risk is at one end of the scale your job to a degree. So I think the emotive part, the human part, becomes very, very real. There was a fascinating study, which I'm sure lots of people in this room have seen, with the CEB. They did that a couple of years ago. Huge sample size of around 3,000 decision makers. And that was at the root of it. The heart of it was saying, if you're a consumer, the end of the day, you can go home and go, I don't like the trainers, I'm going to take them back. Ultimately, that's what you can do. But if you're in the sort of, the B2B space, when you're making a very complex decision, it's a far more emotive play. So I would say 100% the emotive piece is extremely important. We talk about that an awful lot with our clients. And actually, we're starting to see that played back in the creative output as well. So for me, the simple answer is very. It's how you articulate that and start to display that in the messaging to the audience.
And I think, to add to that, I think that plays whether you are talking about a large organisation with the huge buying committees that you've alluded to, or whether you're talking about a small business where actually that decision is critical to the function of your business. And so I think, the person making that decision, whether they're part of a bigger committee or they're making that decision on their own for the benefit of their business, then it's significant, I think, that aspect.
And I think coming back on the point that, Nick, you made around B2B, B2C, I think the consumer guys have absolutely nailed it in terms of data, intelligence, using that properly embedded into the campaigns they create. And I think that's how they've got a much closer guide as to what the human kind of need is. And I think we haven't quite got that yet in B2B. We haven't got the data, or we're not looking for it or using it in the right way. I think that's why we're struggling, and some brands struggle to go, I don't want to kind of move out of my comfort zone because I don't quite understand the customer and what they're going through. And I think the consumer guys have really nailed that.
I think, and also said, I've noticed quite a lot, certainly in the past, 12 to 18 months, the messaging that I'm seeing in my space, which is, I'm firmly sitting in the B2B world, is starting to try and move away from blade servers and speed to a much more emotional play in terms of the broader impact on the business, as opposed to being very specific about gigas and megahertz and those types of things, which, is leading into that, the emotive play and the importance of that, actually, just at a personal level, but then also at a macro business level as well.
So we work across a range of clients where there are obviously B2B only clients, but then also with the likes of BT and Barclays, where there are significant B2C and B2B businesses within. And I think one of the things that we see an awful lot of is cross-learning. And it's our job as an agency that works across all these things to take the best elements out of what maybe a consumer element for business is doing in content and help spread those ideas to the business element and vice versa, because there is no single strength, no dominant strength in either. I think they're a best of both elements.
Okay.
And I think probably to close on that, I'd echo that for organisations that do have both B2B and B2C within, the B2B to C conversation is coming up more and more, and actually about driving influence to create desire from around the organisation, not just those with that decision-making responsibility.
Thank you. So one of the things which, I don't know if any of you have been to the other sessions yesterday, but there seems to be a lot of talk about bravery. And I always associate bravery with sort of, scaling mountains and stuff like that. But what do you think that when we think about bravery and to ask a question that may be on the audience's mind, like what does that mean in terms of risk-taking for your clients and indeed your agencies? So I'd like to, does anyone want to jump in there?
Yep, I think I'll jump in. I think bravery is something we lack in our, because I think it's very difficult for different levels of marketing folk to make decisions, and I think it's up to CMOs, senior VPs to give people the room to take some risks, to do things, to be more creative, and I think that then penetrates all the way through to the brand and says, let's do something a bit different. If you look at what GE does, it's very brave in all the senses of the things they do, whether it's videos, whether it's recruitment work, it's all really lovely stuff, but they've obviously taken a bit of a kind of a leap of faith to say, we think this is going to work, we think this is interesting. And I think we've got to kind of make sure teams are structured in a way that allow people to kind of flourish in that way and not just say, these are the rules we live by and that's all we're going to do.
I mean, going back directly to the question on bravery, we talk about it an awful lot. The senior management, I would say, specifically at Dentsu, talk about bravery. Yeah. And I think there's lots of context you can apply. But I think at our level, bravery to me is having a brave or quite a challenging conversation with your client and bringing that back to the context of content that we're talking about in this particular session. And a colleague of mine who's here today shared, we were discussing the panel, and I was looking at some stuff from the Content Marketing Institute, and there's some staggering statistics that kind of say there's very little actual documented strategy around content taking part in large organisations. So they have a verbal strategy, and actually if you look at the actual statistics, it's there's this huge disconnect between the amount of content being produced and pushed out and actually then strictly measured. And we talk about KPIs an awful lot, and we should do, but actually that disconnect is quite astounding. So the brave conversation in our world now is to challenge that with our with our clients and sort of say, let's scale it back and just make sure that the framework is fully documented and we have the parameters to look at success. And sometimes that can be a brave conversation and just scaling back and taking a moment.
Just want to pick up on that. So that was a really interesting point about the effectiveness piece there. So I don't know if anyone's seen the Content Marketing Institute's report this year, which said that basically 61% of marketers are struggling, or their biggest challenge is actually measuring the effectiveness of content marketing. From each of you, what would your one piece of advice be to the audience on how they go about proving the effectiveness to their organisations?
Well, I think it's really easy to be brave when you know the answer, and that's the fundamental truth of it. So when we talk about technology effectiveness and data as a single entity that allows us to try and generate a what we call a unified model of measurement. So understanding what every single element of the mix at all portions of the funnel contribute to from a sales, revenue, brand metrics perspective. But actually that can be, that sounds easy when you've been doing it for a long time with a single client and you've built up that wealth of data. But as for the clients in the room, I don't think clients challenge agencies nearly enough to help bring out case studies outside of their business. So agencies from a human perspective are conditioned not to share client data because we can't, we shouldn't be allowed to do it. But I think where you do have a blank sheet of paper and you do have permission from elsewhere, I think it can be tremendously powerful to share sympathetic data from another client with all the full permissions to help aid a decision-making process. Because if you don't have your own data to base Bravery on, well, then you should use proxy data. And that's what agencies are here to do. We're here to operate with scale, but we're also here to share learnings internally, white labeled, third partied, whatever you want to do it. I think there's a trick missing often in terms of leveraging agency knowledge outside of your own advertising budget.
Right. So it feels like there's an opportunity there for clients to kind of give permission or to open up that, and it will share that knowledge across obviously the industry internally, the relationships that you have. Laura, what's your perspective on that, on the effectiveness piece?
I mean, it's kind of pretty much how I sort of open that piece. I mean, as I said, the statistics I've read on the documentation of a content strategy, they don't match. We talk so much. I mean, pretty much every conversation that I have with with any client around content is, have we audited it? We have these, but then we actually get to the crux of, what are the measurement KPIs? And actually, if that fundamental documentation structure is not in place, you are not going to achieve the goals. You're going to have no measurability. So I think if I was going to give one piece of advice, pick a channel, a content channel, whether that's your blog channel, whether that's your white paper channel, and properly follow what each piece of content is doing for your campaign and what you're trying to achieve with it. So if you feel that you can't do all of it, start with one and track that, and then build up from there, because it will give you some consistencies and some benchmarks. And then you have a story as well, because also that's fundamental. We talk about storytelling an awful lot, but you have to be able to have some data points to produce a story. So pick one channel if you feel that the whole complexity is potentially too much, but make sure you have a fully documented strategy that's not just verbal, because as I said, if you look at the statistics, and I advise everyone to go and have a look at the CMI and look at those stats, it's extremely important, but it's also slightly worrying. And that's what I would say. I mean, it sounds quite fundamental and basic, but I think that's, have a proper framework, pick a channel, measure it, and see what the effect is, and stop and take a breath as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that, because where does the measurement start and end? I think there are so many tools and technologies available to us today to analyse content consumption, but if you have a content strategy that is aligned to your buyer's journey, so if you have taken a step back and done that content audit, been brave and assessed what content is right for your customers, you've aligned it to the various stages of the buying journey that you've identified, where, what is going to be the most useful data to get from analysing it? There's going to be so much data out there, especially when you're working with global B2B brands that are, that have got worldwide marketing programs in place. But it doesn't just end, I don't think, when somebody engages with you, when they go into the funnel, when they become that MQL and move through to an opportunity. It goes all the way through to the content the sales organisation are continuing to use as they continue that dialogue through to turning, if it's lead generation, those opportunities into converted business.
Yeah. My advice would be, don't work in isolation. Marketing very often, sits in isolation and worries about what it's measuring, but uniquely in B2B, we are sales and marketing together. We have a common goal of selling stuff and generating revenue. And if the content you're creating isn't contributing to that purpose, what's it doing? I remember talking to a client last year, and they introduced all of their analytics on content. 80+% of the content they produced never got read, never got touched. What are we doing? So you've got to think about that common goal, but work really close with sales, because they're close to the customer. They should be telling us that's working, that's not working. We combine that with the data we're collecting more broadly and try and make some good decisions from there.
So Alex, it sounds very complex in terms from a sort of putting a sort of an agency or a creative agency hat on here, or client hat on, in terms of actually delivering this content marketing, personalised advertising to individuals. Like what, how practical and achievable really is this?
No, not at all. I think it is, over the last few years, B2B, we're really good at personalised marketing. We do account-based marketing programs. We're really close to a discrete set of audiences, so we kind of know them really well. We can get insights from sales. We can produce lovely small campaigns. And I think that's great, and we're using technology to kind of enhance that, and we're using new data inputs from multiple channels to help enhance that. I think I think that's great, and that can keep improving. When we start to talk about mass personalisation, mass advertising, I think it's incredibly difficult until we're mapping the human brain neurons and knowing exactly what every single thing's doing. We're never going to get it right, and actually we more than often will get it wrong, which we could argue is going to do more harm to the business or the brand than normal. If you look at Amazon, they probably collect more data than anybody in the world, I should think, and you still get recommendations that don't quite make sense. And that's just because we live in the moment we live in, and we make decisions based on what we're doing. And business has more of a rational way of purchasing, but we still make decisions based on whatever's happening in that environment at that moment. So I think discrete campaigns, yeah, it's improving. Mass personalisation, difficult, and probably not in my lifetime.
I think this is, again, one of those areas where it can actually be far more energising to work in the B2B space than it can be in the B2C. I think what you generally find is agency communities within the B2B space tend to be more agile, more nimble. They change up. And when we're dealing with content in B2C, to try and actually align, from creative agency to media agency to distribution, can be really cumbersome, really difficult, very slow. Whereas my experience within B2B tends to be able to actually bring content to market much quicker. Now, the key to that is just making sure that we're targeting the right content to the right elements of that funnel, as I said earlier. But we should never be in a position where we're trying to add too many more layers into our agency communities to ape that more laggardly B2C model. So I think from kind of mass advertising, personalised, yeah, totally achievable. We're already doing an awful lot of it. When it comes to mass personalised content, far, far harder.
Okay. So I want to move on into the actual the job of doing that, and whose job really it is to do content marketing, because I think whoever you talk to, different types of agencies, different departments within the clients, everyone seems to think that they own content marketing and it's the preserve of them. So Sinead, I'd like to come to you. What's your take on that?
So our experience would be that I think there's a kind of misconception on that area of ownership, because certainly if I look at the client organisations that I work with, there will be content owners. Mm-hmm. They will not necessarily be the people that are working to devise the go-to-market strategy for the campaigns that are going out. However, they are fundamental to feeding the content into those programs. So who owns it within our clients? It's actually, I think it doesn't sit in any siloed place. It's actually a shared responsibility within the marketing organisations, because the success of any single go-to-market strategy isn't going to be, it's just not going to work if content doesn't play into that carefully. So content is a critical role for some of our clients, and they are the ones that are doing it well. The people that actually have responsible for content generation and development sit right within the heart of the teams that are developing those strategies, contribute to the strategy as it's being defined. And how that plays back into the agency is that it sits fundamentally with strategy, planning and creative together. No single creative idea that we would come up with in the agency is going to work on its own if strategy isn't plugged in. The best content strategies I have seen developed for us is when the two parts of the agency come close together and the content drives the creative output and vice versa. So we get it best, we get it right when we're all in a room together. When we're in there with the client, and we are brainstorming with planning, strategy, creative and the relevant stakeholders within our client organisation.
And how often does that, in your experience, how often does that one room kind of come together?
I would say
It sounds great.
20% of the client base are doing it that way. And I would say that you'd see that as they take those programs to market.
Okay.
I think it's about bravery again. I think it's looking at your marketing organisation and say, can we continue to work in these ways we've always worked? Do we just start again? Is there a new way to look at it? And I think if even us as an agency, we've kind of committed we've got a new building called Sea Containers, which is its sole purpose is to bring all of our different parts of our group together to work in a much more agile way. So you've got content in there, you've got the media guys, you've got campaign creators, planners, and that's kind of our commitment to say we need to work in a different way to deliver the right kind of content.
Yeah.
And it's quite fluid, I think.
It depends on the, there's a sort of fundamental asset, depends on the size of the organisation. So if you're working with a global multinational who is huge and has, sort of diverse footprint globally, there is going to be a multitude of stakeholders. And again, if you look at the wheel at CIM, it reflects that. If you've got an SMB organisation, it could be the CEO, actually. So it's also very reflective of the size of the organisation and then us being able to adapt to that that size and also their geo footprint. APJ is very different to the EMEA region and how they look at content. So you're opening up a very different conversation there.
Yeah.
Great stuff. So I would like to draw things to a close. We're running short on time, but I want to thank you very much for that individually. I thought it was great. There are a few things that really standing out here. Number one is this thing, I know we laughed about it at the beginning, but this thing about being brave and taking risks and challenging challenging the client and your individual stakeholders. Really about also on the measurement piece, really understanding what happens when you do a great piece of content marketing and following it through the organisation, starting at the beginning and then building it out from there. And I think really thinking of your audience as a human and a professional. We've seen that already this morning, but that is really crucial as brands look to connect at scale. So with that, I'd just like to thank you again. Please do join me in thanking panel and congratulating. Why not? Thank you very much.